Welcome to the narrated step-by-step tutorial for my painting Cascade. Before I begin, I'll mention that there was no reference used for this painting. As you'll see when I do my sketch, I begin by drawing some very simple shapes and giving an indication of direction. The composition in my painting will evolve as part of my painting process. I like to do these types of paintings occasionally. It helps me loosen up and focus on design and not so much about trying to interpret a specific subject or photograph. So I have an idea in my mind of what I want. I know that I'm going to have a couple major shapes to represent some floral elements, and then I want to try and give an indication of direction, and I'll have some leafy foliage shapes. So right now I'm just taking a B pencil, I'm working on a quarter sheet, and I'm just sketching some shapes here that will represent the floral elements in this composition. I'm also giving some indication of some leafy foliage coming off of these larger shapes. And as I make these, I'm thinking a little bit about direction, I'm thinking about size, and also when I drew the floral elements, I didn't want them all to be the same size. I wanted to have a little bit of overlap. And now I'm just sketching some stems or some linear shapes here just to help give the feeling of direction here. I want to have this movement coming from the left upper corner down to the right and kind of coming through the floral elements and off the page on the right side. You can see by no means is this a detailed sketch, and as I mentioned, there's no reference that I'm using to draw this. I just have an image in my mind that I want to create, so I'm just lightly sketching some of the key elements. As you can see, I have a very simple sketch here. I've indicated where some of the major floral elements are going to be, a few of the smaller leafy shapes which I'll build on, and given some linear marks that give an indication of direction that I want to try and create this motion, of sweeping motion coming through my composition. Before I begin to paint, let me review the colors used in this painting. Quinacridone gold, quinacridone coral, mauve, sap green, royal blue, and pyrrole red. While these are the colors I chose for this particular painting, there's a variety of colors that you could use and have success with this type of a composition. I'm going to begin by starting to put down some large soft washes, and I'm working on a quarter sheet, 11 inches by 15 inches, 140-pound cold press Watercolor watercolor paper. I'm working at about a 20-degree angle, and my paper is taped to my gator board with masking tape and rolled with a wooden roller. As I begin, I'm working wet on dry. I'm using a large round wash brush. This is a silver black velvet jumbo round small brush, and I've started to put down washes of quinacridone gold with a little bit of quinacridone coral in it, and some sap green. Here I've switched to a larger brush. I'm using a 1-inch flat wash brush. This again is a silver black velvet, and it's a nice soft wash brush. It's a squirrel synthetic blend. After I apply generous amounts of the wash, I come in with a fine mist spray and start softening the edges of the wash that I put down. And I'm trying to help follow the direction of some of the linear marks and try and start to use that to guide me through this painting with some of my paint application, some of the brush strokes and some of the directional marks that I'll make with a spray bottle, and when I come back in later in the process and do some lifting. I'm trying to create this kind of sweeping motion from the upper left to the lower right. While I began working wet on dry, after I come in with a 5-mist spray bottle, the paper is very saturated, and any brush marks I make after that point will be working wet in wet until I choose to dry my paper, which I do frequently with a hairdryer. While I continue to apply some of these washes, I'll briefly discuss what I think about when I'm developing a painting like this. As I mentioned, there's no reference for this painting, so I'm not trying to interpret a specific subject or a photograph of a subject or a scene. So what do I think about? I think about design elements. So the things that I start to consider are things such as the shapes, size of shapes. I have these kind of static floral elements. I want to vary the size on those. I think about color, and I think about warm versus cool. What's going to be dominant? My intention in this particular painting is to have a warm dominance. As I had mentioned in my sketch, I have some linear shapes I was making to indicate direction. So 2 other elements of design there, line and direction. As this painting continues to evolve, I'll also be thinking very much about value and value contrast. So those are the kinds of things that I think about when I'm developing a painting like this. It's not trying to interpret a specific subject, but trying to use the elements of design, the principles of design, to develop my composition. I've dried my paper at this point because I want to start to introduce some mauve into my washes, and if I let that get too involved with some of the gold tones I have down, it would have neutralized each other and taken away some of the purity of the color. So I decided to dry the wash that I had put down with a quinacridone gold, quinacridone coral, and some sap green. And now I'm going to come back in here with some mauve. While I chose to use quinacridone gold for this painting, I could have also have used some gamboge, and it would have given a very nice result. It would have been a little bit brighter than the quinacridone gold. The quinacridone gold tends to have a little bit of earthiness to it, but you could use, as I mentioned, any number of colors. It doesn't have to be in these families necessarily. You could do a number of color combinations and get some very pleasing results. I mentioned that my intention is to keep a warm dominance for this painting, and I could use these same colors and kept a cool dominance and use more of the green and purple tones to achieve more of a cool dominance, and it would look completely different. When I laid down my first initial wash there, I used the warm quinacridone gold because I want that to be dominant. If I was going with a cooler dominance, I probably would have started with that one first. You can see that I have a lot of gradation of color going on, and colors merging and mingling, and some of these washes over top of some of the earlier washes. And as my painting evolves, I start with these lighter, softer edged washes, and then I start to go darker, and I start to work towards smaller shapes and harder edges. But I've actually gone fairly dark here pretty early with this mauve that I'm using. It's a pretty dark valued color, and I'm also taking some royal blue alongside of it. As you can see right there, that has royal blue, and taking my spray bottle to diffuse those colors a little bit over top of the warm wash that I put prior to these layers. Since I don't have a reference for my painting, you might ask what prompts me to put a mark down in any particular place. I always say that you shouldn't be making a brush mark unless you have a specific reason for making it. In this case, what's guiding me is I want to define shapes, and I want to define edges specifically. So I'm putting some of these cool tones of purple or mauve and royal blue along edges that I want to define. And then in this early stage, I like to soften those edges. And at the same time, I'm bringing in that spray, I'm softening the edge. I'm also trying to use those to create direction. You can see that I'm often pulling that spray in the direction that I mentioned, that I'm trying to create that sweeping motion coming from the top down to the right side, from top left to bottom right. So here, each one of these marks is helping to define an edge, which further defines the shape. And as I build my composition here, I'll start making some of these smaller marks, and I'll start to define some of the leafy shapes and start to define some of the linear shapes that are moving through here. And a lot of this is coming from my imagination. But as I'll make a mark, it's normally for a specific reason that I'm making that mark. Now I've dried the painting, and I'm going to take a value checker and put it on the painting, and you can see the range of values that I have. I've started to build in some dark shapes. You can see right there is a fairly dark wash in there. But for the most part, I'm very much to light middle value. As I develop this painting, I'm envisioning this darker shape that's kind of feeding behind these floral elements, sweeping down and then swinging down a little bit towards the bottom in the middle there. And that's just something that I've kind of visualized in my head as I start to develop this. And I want to erase some of these pencil marks that I made. I've defined the shapes. I'm going to handle it pretty much with brushwork from here. But some of those areas are going to be very light, and I want to get rid of some of those pencil marks before I glaze over them and make it very tough to remove. Now, working with my quill brush, I'm taking a mixture of quinacridone and coral with a little bit of quinacridone and gold in it. And I'm making some brush marks that give the suggestion of the center of a flower. And then once I've made the mark, I soften it with a spray, and the hard edges on these marks kind of dissolve and just gives just the impression of overlapping flower petals. So I'm doing the same thing here, just making some marks here that would be representative of the petals of a flower. And when I'm painting like this, I'm not necessarily trying to paint anything specific. I'm just giving a suggestion of a floral element here, and this is more of a designer piece type piece, and I just have a little bit of fun with it. Here again, taking some of that same kind of a dark middle value, and then just hit it with the spray. This is a fine mist spray, and let that dissolve a little bit and run. And I touch my brush here and there into the wet paper and strengthen up just a few areas. Once again, I've dried my paper, and now I'm coming in with a little bit more green here. This is sap green, and I really haven't added anything much to this mixture of sap green. Occasionally I'll add a little bit of pyrrole red to tone it down a little bit, but this is pretty much pure sap green. And then I'm taking my fine mist spray and softening that and letting that diffuse that color. And once again, I still try and keep in mind the directional flow that I'm trying to achieve through my painting. So I can put those marks down and let them sit for a little bit, but I can't let them set too long or the edges will start to dry and it'll be tough to soften up. But I can work around the composition and come back and spray those marks that I've made, and still have plenty of time that I can soften those edges and diffuse the color without it setting an edge. You'll notice when I spray, often I get my bottles inverted, and it's actually the top is pointing down. I start very close to the paper and I tend to pull away and lift as I pull away. And when I'm doing a top edge, such as where I am at right now, there's times when I'll flip my board over and spray it away from that edge. Other times I won't. I'll just spray it away and it'll hold enough that I'm not worried about it coming down into an area that I don't want it. And but I can control it pretty well with the spray. And that green, we'll see how it dries. Some of the green I'll work with from here on out will be toned down a little bit with some Pyrrole red. That's pretty green, pretty bright green right there. Here you can see I'm just putting some touches of this color in various areas of the composition. And as I make those marks, I'm trying to define edges of flower shapes or leafy shapes. And it's just that continuation of building up that definition of edge, which starts to give dimension to the shapes and depth to the overall composition. Now here I'm making marks similar to what I just did with the sap green, and I'm using a mixture of quinacridone and coral with a little bit of quinacridone and gold in it, but the majority of it is quinacridone and coral. And just putting down some brush marks here to define edges. You can see I've defined a linear mark there, a lighter linear mark there right on the edge of that floral element by painting around it. So as I start to do this, I rely heavily on the development of positive and negative edges, which help define positive and negative space. When I paint like this, it's all about working with positive and negative space and positive and negative edges. And much of the painting gets its personality very early with the initial washes that I put on. And some of those areas of the paper will change very little as I develop the painting. That wash will come through in the finished painting. But I work around defining edges, defining shapes, starting to build values. As I start to build some of these darker values, I start to put depth into my composition. Here I'm starting to paint around some leafy shapes, and then I soften that edge and diffuse that color away. So I use this continual buildup of layers by starting to define an edge and then diffuse the wash away from that edge and soften it. So I get this combination of soft and hard edges developing and a lot of lost and found edges. Here I want to see the edge of this floral shape up here a little more. I want it to be have better definition. So I put that wash right on the edge of it and then diffuse it away from it. And I often use a tissue just to blot an edge or soften and pick up a little extra water. And I like sometimes the irregularity that it creates in a wash. Here again, now you can start to see by putting that wash like I have, you can start to see the shape come forward. And then it starts to push the background back a little bit. Just as I did with the sap green, I'm working around the composition, putting touches of this quinacridone and coral, quinacridone and gold mixture. And I'm defining the edge and then softening that wash going away with this spray. And you can start to see those shapes starting to come forward, and you see this color starting to weave throughout the composition. Here I've dried it again, and now you can see that I'm starting to get more dark, more value contrast in the overall composition. I'm going to come in with my mauve. I want to start to get some harder edges using the mauve color. So taking the same approach, using the same technique, putting down a dark mark and then starting to fuse it away. So here again, you can see I'm putting that mark right on the edge of that shape, that floral shape. So that'll help define that shape and give a little more clarity, at the same time build depth into my composition. Sometimes I'll make these marks and I'll just put a general spray over them. Other times it'll soften that little mark, and other times I'll just come in and try and take it in one direction away and leave one edge hard, one edge soft. Here I'm using this quill brush, and this mauve is a very dark valued color, and this is just pure mauve. with the marks that I'm making right now, not only am I getting darker values, but I'm starting to change the size of my shapes. Now I'm starting to get some smaller shapes into my painting. Up to this point, everything's been very large in general in the types of shapes that I was making and the washes I was putting down. Now I'm starting to make some smaller, hard-edged marks that start to give more definition to the composition. It helps, again, it helps to build depth in the composition. And this is just an ongoing process as this painting evolves. So I have envisioned some leafy shapes here and some vines or stems, some linear marks here. So I'm painting around those shapes that I'm envisioning there, and then soften that edge. But you can see that the result is a hard edge and a soft edge, where that color gradates away. But now you start to get a little bit more definition of what's going on in that specific area. And as I develop this painting, I'm not going to do it with the same level of detail in every square inch of this painting. There's some areas that I'm not going to develop very much at all, and other areas I'll go into more detail with harder edges, smaller shapes, darker values, more contrast, more towards the focal point. You can't have the entire composition just so busy that the viewer doesn't know really where you want them to look. So in my initial sketch, there were some leaf shapes here, and I'm starting to paint around some of those shapes. Here you can start to see by painting off the edge, on the negative edge of that leafy shape, I've started to define it. And sometimes I'll do that, I'll actually start to define another leaf shape. But I put that mark, then I softened it and blotted it, and now you can start to see the edge of that leafy shape. So I'm going to continue to build up these layers of wash and these layers of these brush marks that I put down to help further define some of these shapes. Sometimes I refer to it as carving shapes out of the composition here, or the wash. So I have this initial wash down here, and I've built up some layers with some softer edges, but the further I go in my painting process, they start to get darker and harder edges and smaller shapes. And you can see now, just by painting around the edge of this, I've started to define that leaf without actually painting it. I'm painting the space around it, or painting off what I call the negative edge, and it starts to define that shape even though I'm not actually painting the leaf itself. Here again, you can see just the edges that I'm painting, and you can see that tip of the leaf that I just painted. I'm going to soften that wash, but I didn't want to bring that down all the way to the bottom and touch the edge. That would create an undesirable tangent. So I stopped at about a ½ inch short of that. The other thing I could have done is run that off the page a little bit, but I don't want that point of a leaf to end right on the edge of my composition. Here, I'm taking this mauve and pretty pure mixture here that has a lot of it's rich in pigment. It's very a fluid mixture, even though it's very dark. I'm going to hit it with this spray, and it's really going to run. And that doesn't bother me at all. I think sometimes people that aren't used to painting like this, they get concerned when the paint starts running around on the paper. But I like the effect that I get, even though that it's very fluid and there's a lot of water. I still feel I can control to the extent I need to where it's going to go. And if it gets over something that I don't want, which it does, a lot of times I'll just blot it up, or take my spray bottle and just kind of spray it away and then blot it up, and it'll clean up pretty easily if it's in an area that I don't want. I'm going to take that mauve here on the edge of this flower and then diffuse that color down just as I did on the other, and it really, I think, starts to make that floral shape pop. Now I'm going to switch my color a little bit and use a mixture that's heavy with quinacridone and coral, and it's got a little quinacridone gold in it, but it's darker value than the mixture I was using. And now I'm starting to work off positive and negative edges to help define some of the shapes of my composition, just as I did with the mauve and some of the green. So here you can see I'm starting to paint around the edge of some leafy shapes. And when I do that, I try not to just outline it. I break that up and let some of these edges get lost and found again. Just as I did with the mauve and green, I'm taking some of this mixture, painting it off the edge, and then I'm just going to use some water in my brush here to soften that down a little bit. Here I'm developing another kind of leafy shape here by painting around the outer edge of it. A lot of times the initial wash that I put down at the very start becomes somewhat my color roadmap. It's not that I don't put some other colors in there, but in general you can see that I'm developing the gold and warm tones in the area where the warmer wash was, and then the cooler tones are more in the area where I put them in my initial wash. I want to bring these shapes out a little bit more and build some depth. So I'm putting a darker value, and I'm envisioning another leaf shape going behind those. So I've started to build more layers, more depth in my composition by doing this, and I'll continue to do that as I develop this composition further. So here a little darker value, and you can see that I've taken that on. There's a break there, just to show a linear shape, that's a lighter linear shape that's moving across that dark area. So just the same thing here. I'm putting in kind of a darker gold leaf shape, but I've left a break in it to give the suggestion of a linear shape, lighter linear shape moving over it. I want to go darker with the value in the center of these floral elements. So I'm coming in with a darker mixture here. This has some of the quinacridone coral, and I'm putting it on top of the areas or the marks that I put in earlier and softened them quite a bit, and they were fairly light. So now you can see this darker value, taking the same approach though, putting down the brush mark and then softening it and letting it diffuse some with a fine mist spray. So I'm doing some of the same on the other floral shapes here. And then I come in with a fine mist spray and just touch them. When I spray, especially when I'm spraying something like this, I don't necessarily depress the spray button down all the way. Sometimes it may just be as little as a quarter of the way down, just a touch, just to give the mist that I'm after. And here, while I have this tone, I'm taking some of that over to the edge of these floral shapes and making some smaller, hard-edged, dark brush marks. I'm going to move around my composition with this dark warm mixture, and I'm going to look for areas where I can help build the depth into my painting. So some of these leafy shapes that I have, some of the linear shapes that I have, and along the floral elements, I'm going to put some of these smaller dark shapes, these warm dark shapes around off of edges, and give the indication or the suggestion that some of these marks are moving behind shapes. And you'll see sometimes I'll start a mark on one side of a lighter shape and I'll bring it out on the other side. So this is just a process of building my values around my composition, defining edges. Here I'm just looking for areas where I can sharpen an edge, build some depth. And there's a lot of lost and found edges when I'm doing this. So like I had mentioned, I try to avoid completely outlining some of these shapes. I just put marks that just go part way, and then there's a break, and I let the viewer complete that, make that connection between some of these marks, that they know that that edge continues even though I haven't fully communicated that through my brush strokes. I made a number of marks with the darker warm tone, and I'm continuing doing the same with some of the cooler tones, the mauve and the royal blue. So here I'm making some small dark valued marks. You can see how I'll start a small shape and I'll stop, lift my brush, continue it. So there's a break that gives the suggestion of overlap and helps validate the depth in the composition. When I'm doing a painting like this, I like to include a variety of linear marks that help enhance the directional flow of what's going on in my composition. And one of the things I like to do once I have some dark values is I'll take a damp brush. In this case, it's about a 1/2 inch angled nylon brush, and it's damp. It's not saturated, so it doesn't have a bead of water, but it's damp, and I'll do some lifting. So I'm taking that, I'm lifting some of the paint, and I'll touch it with a tissue to help lift that paint off. But it's very subtle. This isn't a very aggressive brush. You can see that there's just some very subtle marks being made there. And what I'll do is I'll come back in with some paint and I'll paint around the edges of those on either side to help strengthen the contrast between the linear mark and the area that it's going over. The other thing that I'm doing while I do this is, in one area while I'm lifting, I'm also trying to drag some of that pigment off the darker shape on over the lighter shape. So I go from a light in the dark field to a darker linear mark on a light area. So it goes kind of from a negative to a positive shape. I use a 1-inch brush. It's a paddle brush. It's also nylon, and it is more aggressive at lifting. So I'm going to take this, and it has a broader area that it lifts. So I'm going to take this brush, and I'm going to do some lifting. And I use these to help work around. I'll paint a leafy shape under one of these marks that I've made, and I'll build the value up, and it'll help strengthen the lighter linear shape that I've made by lifting. So it just helps give me some more ideas on where I can do some more shape making just by putting in these linear marks, because then I start working around them, and it helps me build another layer of depth into my composition. So I put my value checker on it again, and now you can start to see the contrast that's happening across a large part of this composition now. Now I'm going to take some of my green mixture, and in this instance I'm using the sap green with some pyrrole red mixed into it, and it's got quite a bit of pigment, so it's fairly dark. And I've actually added a touch of royal blue to it also. So here I'm going to continue making some of the smaller dark shapes off edges and around linear shapes and linear marks to continue to build depth into my painting and further evolve this composition. I find that painting in this manner can be conceptually difficult for people to understand sometimes. It's much more direct when you're looking at a reference photo and you're trying to interpret the photo and you have something to go to. But when you're on your own and you're trying to create shapes and you're trying to envision value patterns, it can get difficult, even though it's kind of a simple process. Conceptually, it can be hard to understand. I know sometimes when I'm demonstrating, somebody will say, well, how do you know that to put that leafy shape there? Or why did you paint it that color? Or why aren't you painting this or that? Or why aren't you painting the whole thing? And so I think it's a difficult approach to take doing a painting this way, but it really will help you loosen up. It will help you focus on design, and you'll use a full array of fundamentals on hard edges, soft edges, lost and found edges. You'll be working with a lot of gradation, a lot of transition of color. You're working with warm and cool, a variety of shapes, different sizes. You're focusing on direction in this instance. So really, I think really it's a very involved thinking process you go through. That being said, myself, I enjoy painting this way sometimes. I take a similar approach to doing some of the cityscapes that I do. One of the things I'll do is I start to get pretty far in my painting process. Once I've done a lot of smaller brush work and I've started to carve some shapes and started to get that feeling of a flow, a directional flow, I'll come in and I'll start to glaze over some of that to push some areas back and help bring other areas forward. So I kind of I bring these shapes forward in two ways and build depth kind of in two ways. I do it with some of the hard-edged brushwork that I use to define edges, and then I also do it by coming in with some soft glazing to push some areas back and then help bring other areas forward. Here again, I'm putting in some brush marks and then softening it with a spray bottle. I find I use the spray bottle more in this type of a painting, that the application fits this subject very well, this technique very well, and I use it more in this type of a painting than I do in say a landscape. I'm going to use a wash of this mauve to push some of this area here around this floral element back. So as I put this paint down, it's hard to pick up on the camera, but it's a very wet mixture that I'm putting down. So as I'm bringing it to the paper, my brush is fairly saturated, and the mixture, even though it's very fluid, is very rich in pigment. So this is some of the mauve. And once I get some of these brush marks in where I want, I'm going to take my fine mist spray here and I'm going to just soften and diffuse that color. And it helps push that back and bring that floral element forward. And I'll do the same here. Now I've got a darker value mixture of my green. So I have sap green with some pyro red and some royal blue in it. And I'm once again I'm painting some smaller shapes because I want to bring a little more depth to this area of my painting. So I'm working around some of the shapes that I already had there and selectively putting in some dark values to help deepen this area of my painting and build that depth. You can see how dark I've gotten in that area. Now I want to bring some more of that brushwork and that dark value down towards the bottom of my painting here underneath this shape, this flower shape. So once again, just some hard edge, small shapes around some of the shapes that I've already established in my painting. And hopefully you can see there how the brushwork I'm doing is starting to bring forth some of the other shapes and give a little bit more definition to them. And you can see where I break up some of these darker values and give the suggestion of overlap and lighter shapes moving over top of darker shapes and darker shapes over lighter shapes. I'm going to put a few more touches of value here, a little darker value, warm value, and just spray it, soften that edge a little bit, just in a couple places. Now I'm going to take a liner brush and I'm going to take some dark values and I'm just going to make some linear marks. And I like to do this on these types of compositions. I like to weave some of these kind of grassy shapes, linear shapes throughout the composition. I'll lift my brush to give the suggestion that there's overlap going on. Just little touches here and there. And I pay attention to the direction of the mark that I'm making. I'm going to put a white mat on this to get a good look at it. And there's my painting, Cascade. I hope you enjoyed this video. If this is something you want to try, you can go to the Online Learning Center and go to the YouTube reference link at the top and you'll find the image of the painting. I didn't do a posting of the sketch since it's just simple major shapes and the painting evolves through the painting process, and there is no reference photo for this painting. If you have questions about the materials I use, you can go to the studio page of my website on rsurwitzart.com. And if you have specific questions, you can email me at contactrsurwitzart@gmail.com. Thanks for watching.